Right, good afternoon, everybody. So it's 12:30, so we have an hour, so we'll make the most of that time. Just a few bits and pieces before I hand over to our presenter today. Thanks for joining us for this session on practical skills to sharpen your project management skills, one of our very popular webinars. It's going to be presented by Derek Bell, who's one of our associates who's worked with us with a number of clients over the years. Just a couple of ground rules before we start. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. We'd rather leave that at the end so Derek can get through the presentation, but if there's a flood of questions on a particular topic, it may be the case that we can pause the presentation, but as a rule, we'll try and answer as many questions as we can at the end. We do have a limited time, so it may be the case that we can't answer all questions, but we'll try our best to do so. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Derek and enjoy the presentation. There will be polls as well, so I should mention throughout the presentation. So again, please participate as much as possible. Feel free to ask questions, get involved with the polls, and hopefully enjoy the presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Darren. I'd just like to say that thinking back when I was initially contacted by the Institution of Mechanical Engineers as to whether I could provide develop and deliver a webinar, I leapt at the opportunity. I'm originally a mechanical engineer in terms of my degree, and I really wanted to focus on how could I maximise the value to you, the attendants. I thought about mechanical engineers, and I thought mechanical engineers generally like tools. We like things that help us. And so I've tried to focus upon the 3 tools that I think really help you if you're involved in a project, whether you're the project manager or whether you've got technical work that contributes to a larger project. 3 tools that I think are essential to drive better understanding of your stakeholders, understanding of the scope of the project that you're involved in. And one of the third tool is really one whereby you can clarify what's important to the participants in a project without you being seen as the person who's blocking the way forward. We've got a brief agenda, therefore. We're looking at what I regard as the essential stakeholder analysis tool. It's often referred to as the power interest grid. There's variations on that theme, but I'm showing you the fundamental tool for helping us understand our stakeholders and determine what kind of strategies we're going to use to engage with them. Looking at defining the project scope as a team rather than the project manager imposing it upon the team. I think the WBS, absolutely vital tool. If you're wondering what it stands for, well, I've got a question on that later on, so I'll leave it as hanging in the air if it's not a tool that you've used before. And then helping your stakeholders to clarify the prioritization. We're going to be using the Moscow tool to drive our understanding. Now, I've got the opportunity to just briefly introduce myself. As I said, I've got a degree in mechanical engineering. My career, after a couple of technical roles with the likes of Land Rover, where I was principal engineer, computer-aided engineering, and then getting more commercial knowledge with part of the Tarmac Group as computer services manager. But I was always sort of interested in developing others and helping others, and the project management route sort of was attractive to me. I've got numerous qualifications over the years, so I'm a fully qualified project manager with respect to the APM qualifications, PMI, I'm a PMP, and numerous agile related qualifications as well, and was made a fellow of the Association of Project Management this year. In terms of the collage on the right hand side, prior to the lockdown, for many years, I was traveling the world helping organizations. I probably spent 60 to 70% of my life outside of the UK. So we've got some shots of Baku and US and Doha and other locations. The risks of travel are shown in the bottom right-hand corner because what's interesting, actually, I'm just looking across, and although my slides are moving forward on my screen, the presentation, can I just get confirmation from Darren that the presentation is reflected correctly, that we've moved on to the correct slide?
Looking at your presentation, we're on your CV type, your host slide at the moment.
Fantastic. It's just that sorry about that interruption. I was just looking at my backup screen that was supposed to be giving me a view of what you're seeing. It was just actually still stuck at the initial slide. So it's great that the presentation's fine. Bottom right hand corner, this shows you some of the dangers of travel, because this was a location in America where we were hosting a 2-week long course for 50 delegates, and we had a flood. but we were able to continue. So sometimes travel can be a challenge. The virtual environment that we're currently in is actually a powerful one for communication. So I've really found that people are latching on to training and development using the virtual model, and it avoids some of those challenges going forwards. I do hope you'll find this a sort of a nice relaxed presentation. Feel free to raise questions at any time, and Darren as moderator will then sort of communicate the questions. We'll have a Q&A at the end, but you could have a question that needs immediate answering. Moving on to consider tools. Tool number 1, the power interest grid. Here's the first of the polls, and what we're going to ask you is, have you heard of the power interest grid already? And the answers that you have available to you is yes, I use it regularly on projects. Yes, I have used it. Yes, I understand it, but I have not used it. Yes, but not sure what it is. Or no, not until now. If you could please vote. Oh, there is another option, just in case none of the above captures your response. So could you go for, yes, I've used it regularly on project. Yes, I have used it. I understand it, but I have not used it. Not sure what it is. Or no, not until now. If you could please vote now. And hopefully we've got a good number of responses already. Do you want to share the results? Just to give us a feel for whether it's something people already refer to.
Yes.
Far away?
Yeah, so the majority of people are no, not until now.
Not until now. Great. So this is hopefully a useful tool to you. So the power interest grid is all related to understanding your stakeholders. As a starting point, what do we mean by a stakeholder? By all means, use the chat, to give your sort of view. And when you think of the stakeholder, what exactly would you describe as a stakeholder? And what I'd like to highlight is that from a project management perspective, we're being very inclusive here. We're talking about stakeholders as people who could affect your project or could be impacted in turn. And if you think about it, the actual team members are actually part of your stakeholder group. The most dangerous stakeholders are probably the ones who think they should be involved in your project and should impact you, and yet we haven't actually got a role for them in the project because they're not really genuine stakeholders from the organization's perspective. So think of stakeholders as people who could impact the project, people who are impacted by the project and therefore want to sort of understand and engage with the project to ensure it does what they minimizes negative impact and maximizes the positive to them. Now, we've got to really think carefully about why is it so important to understand the stakeholders. A lot of us could be sort of really focused on the technical aspects of a project. We could be really sort of thinking about the technical challenges and coordinating a group of engineers and other disciplines working and collaborating together. But in terms of understanding stakeholders in general, stakeholders are the ones who really state whether or not the project was successfully completed. Sometimes we can have a technical project that was delivered brilliantly technically, but we didn't really engage with the stakeholders and they weren't happy about certain aspects of what we delivered. And of course, your reputation as an individual could be tarnished if you're involved in a project like that. So if you haven't even identified a stakeholder who's got important requirements, then of course you won't be satisfying them, and that could lead to a really negative result in your project. The second bullet about stakeholder alignment, a lot of benchmarking goes on, looking at technical projects and substantial projects, and one of the key drivers of project failure is there is a lack of alignment of the various stakeholders. They had different agendas, they had different desires in terms of what the project was to achieve for them from their perspective, particularly if you're working as a sort of in collaboration with other organizations. So one party could be driven by, I don't know, the technical, challenges of the project and learning from the process. Another partner could be aiming for profitability, and those two different objectives could give you all sorts of issues. So gaining stakeholder alignment early on is really helping you to progress the project and reduce the number of changes that might be incurred later on. In terms of having sufficient resources to get the project done, we never have sufficient additional resource to actually engage fully with every stakeholder that you need to. And hence we have to prioritize stakeholders and work out which stakeholders you really need to reach out to, find out how to build a relationship with them, because they're key to supporting your project through to a successful conclusion. And then sort of treating other stakeholders with respect in terms of giving them the information they need, or just notifying them of changes. But you won't have the same level of relationship with those parties. If you think about it, stakeholders can smooth the way for our project, particularly if you've got powerful individuals who are championing your project. They see the value that it will bring to them, or they're part of the organization. They can be supportive of you, protect you from having resources stolen from you. All too often we find situations where a project is progressing and then another part of the business sort of steals resources from us, causing us all sorts of problems. And of course, if you didn't identify a key stakeholder, sometimes a key stakeholder responds by saying, "You forgot about me, I'm going to stop this project." So they can sink our projects as well. Now, thinking about where this sits within an overall engagement process. And by the way, if you use the term stakeholder management, so the more modern term is really stakeholder engagement, trying to actually think of it. You're not trying to sort of necessarily just control stakeholders, but you're actually trying to engage with them and find out what's important to them and support them effectively. We have stakeholder identification as the first step in the process, which should be a broad sort of review of who could be a stakeholder. And if we don't identify a stakeholder, we leave them out in the cold, that will then cause us problems later on. The power interest grid is very much supportive of the stakeholder analysis. We want to analyze the attributes of the stakeholders to actually think about how we want to approach, what kind of strategies we're going to have to engage with the stakeholders adequately. And then stakeholder engagement is very much carrying out that process, reaching out, analyzing the needs and wants of the various stakeholders in terms of do they need detailed information, do they like to be contacted once a week, once a month, reaching out and communicating too rigorously to a stakeholder who just regards you as pestering them could be negative. The communication planning is the final step to actually document how you will engage with the stakeholders in terms of clarification of who's got responsibilities, what information is to be communicated to whom, how we will receive feedback on that communication so that we actually learn how to engage with people, and then we make sure it's being carried out effectively through the life of the project. So the tool that we're focused upon here, and you can see we've got the little tool icon in the top right hand corner, is the power interest grid. There are variations on this grid. You sometimes find that sort of people talk about influence. I think the power interest grid is the one that I feel most affinity to, and it's the most straightforward way of thinking about the various stakeholders in the project. When we think of the vertical axis on the left-hand side, we've got the vertical axis for power. Power means the ability of that stakeholder to affect change on your project. The ability of that stakeholder to affect change on your project. And the horizontal axis of interest is how likely they are to want to use that power. And it could be they haven't got much power, but they're desperate to try and affect you in some way. Their interest is the likelihood of them wanting to use whatever power they have to affect change upon your project. Now, it's a binary grid. The intention is that you don't place stakeholders in the middle or on the boundaries. In fact, sort of generally speaking, if you think somebody's sort of like relatively in the middle zone, you tend to assume the higher level in order to make sure you've thought about those given stakeholders. So we've got the basic 2x2 grid. Just a little comment here. I've come across organizations that work on, say, a 9x9 grid. And when I've discussed with them, well, what's the difference between a 2 and a 3 or a 3 and a 4? You realize that the putting in lots of gradations isn't really that helpful, because what tends to happen is it sucks in a lot of time as to have we got it in the right square, rather than are we really identifying the main categories of stakeholders. So I'm a big fan of the 2x2 grid. Keep it binary. It tends to be far more effective in terms of its use. Now let's imagine that we're now using the stakeholder analysis. On the right, we've got 4 representations of post-it notes. There could be 44, there could be 444, depending upon the scale of your project. And we've identified 4 stakeholders. The project sponsor, just to clarify the term in case it's not one you use within your organization, it's a project management term for the person that resides above the project manager. So the project manager reports to the project sponsor with respect to, managing the project on a day-to-day basis is the project manager's responsibility, but the project sponsor is the one who secured the funding for the project, is the one who the organization is holding accountable that the project is delivered within a certain timescale, within a certain budget, and so on. So the sponsor sort of resides above the project manager, and as you can see, it's obviously a key role within that relationship. When we go down to a regulator, now of course there could be many different regulators involved in your projects, but the regulator representative could be, say, somebody from the health and safety executive. I did quite a lot of work with the health and safety executive over several years, and they're very sort of important people in terms of ensuring that organisations are adhering to the appropriate regulatory frameworks. If a health and safety officer comes on site and they don't like the way you're carrying out, say, a element of construction in order to rehouse an important piece of machinery, then they can place an order upon you and stop the work. When we talk about end users, we're talking about end users of the end products. So if you're designing, say, a new motor vehicle, it could be people who will actually sort of drive the vehicle or as an end user. And when we talk about the general public, sometimes you can think of the general public getting sort of more organised and banding together. An NGO is a non-governmental organisation. I'm not referring here to, say, powerful NGOs such as Greenpeace, who might object to possible damage to the ecological settings. It's just people sort of grouping together in the general public as a whole. Now, we've got for those 4 post-it notes, I'm going to have another quick poll here. In your opinion, so this is poll number 2, in your opinion, where should the sponsor for a project reside on this grid? If you want the ideal positioning for the sponsor, if we could please run the questionnaire or run the poll.
Yep, poll's been asked, yep.
Fantastic. And if you could vote now, should they be high power, low interest, high power, high interest, option number 3, low power, low interest, or 4, low power, high interest? So in your opinion, where should the sponsor for a project reside on this grid? Okay, if we've got sufficient results,
have a look.
Let's see the results.
Just going to publish these. Yeah, so it's the bulk, about 3/4 have gone for high power, high interest.
Well, my intention
yeah,
was the high power, high interest was where I want my project sponsor. Now, a project sponsor could be your champion for the project. So you want them sufficiently powerful to be able to protect your project, to ring fence your budget for the project and smooth the way for your project. So ideally, I chose it as that's the ideal location. So thank you very much, and congratulations to the over 3/4 who agreed with me. You could have a reason within your organization why you don't want too powerful a project sponsor. It could be that you don't want too interested that they meddle on a daily basis. So you could have alternative reasons why you position them in a different location. Now, the second poll in this area, it's poll number 3. In your opinion, where should the regulator for a project reside on this grid? E.g., if you did have a health and safety inspector visiting your project, where construction is actually being carried out. So the health and safety inspector visiting your project where construction is being carried out, would you want them as, or would you recognize them as being high power, high interest? Sorry, high power, low interest is option number 1. High power, high interest for option 2. Low power, low interest for option 3. Or low power, high interest. Where would you place the regulator representative who could turn up on site? Are we able to share the results?
Yeah, let's have a quick look. Let's publish these. So again, about 3/4 high power, low interest is the most popular response.
Yeah. Sometimes people don't think that kind of regulator is not that interested. It's not the fact they're not interested in ensuring you're compliant, but their focus is upon, are you demonstrating you're compliant or not? If you're in a situation whereby the regulator sees that you're hiding information from them, then they'd have a real concern that this could be an organization that's prepared to, do things that are totally unprincipled, and, people could come to harm. So the regulator's not interested in your specific project, they're interested in you demonstrating compliance. And then they're visiting another site in the afternoon, and they're visiting 2 more sites for the rest of the week. So, that's why we tend to think of them as they're likely to be lower interest and higher in power. Thanks very much for that feedback. Next poll. In your opinion, where should the end user for a project reside on this grid? Option 1, high power, low interest. Option 2, high power, high interest. Option 3, low power, low interest. Or option 4, low power, high interest. So where would we position our end user? And there could be a bit more variability about this one, depending upon your perspective.
Right, shall we look at the results?
Thank you very much.
If you're in, 90% low power, high interest.
Fantastic. So we've actually got a real agreement. The end user hopefully would be interested in the end result, particularly if they're an internal end user. When we think of the general public or NGO as the final one, well, it's going to naturally sort of slide into the monitor zone. The idea being that members of the general public might not have been aware of the concern. If you had, for instance, this construction work for housing a major piece of equipment, an NGO might form from local population who suddenly get concerned about maybe the noise levels during construction. So they might be sort of having challenges and suddenly organize themselves and start mobilizing, in which case we monitor where they move to. Now, on that note, we've discussed stakeholder analysis using the power interest grid. For those of you who haven't used the power interest grid before, if we could run the final poll for this section, for those of you who haven't used the power interest grid before, would you feel confident in using it in your next project? We've got 3 options available to you. Yes, it will be helpful. Yes, but I probably won't. It's not really that useful to me as I'm not involved in that aspect. Or no, I wouldn't feel confident in using it in my next project. So I just want to get a feel for the success of this presentation. So yes, it will be helpful. I would feel I could use it in my next project. Yes, but I probably won't. Not that relevant to me. Or no. Could you please vote? Okay, and if you could just share the results.
Yep.
Fantastic. I just want to get some sort of feedback.
Yes, 77% saying yes, it will be helpful. And then 21% saying yes, but I probably won't.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We'll hop over the next poll and we'll dive into just a couple of final slides on stakeholder engagement. The final bullet that I've added there, because we saw the slide previously about how important it is, final word of warning. Careful who you share it with. Imagine if you displayed the power interest grids and a stakeholder who you voted as low power got to see where you position them. So that's the final point about the power interest grid. It is a tool to be used by the internal team, and you do want to make sure that you're not sort of likely to upset a stakeholder, because an upset stakeholder can make things very difficult for you. Thanks very much for your engagement there. We're moving on to the second tool because we've got a fair bit to cover in our session, and I want to allow time for questions and answers. The WBS. We're going to hop over to poll number 7. Do you know the term WBS already? And I want to clarify, this is a project management term, not a reference to the Warwick Business School or any other similar institution. So yes, I know the term WBS already, or no, it's a new term to me, which I haven't encountered as yet. So if you could please vote on that. Do you know the term WBS already? And it's a project management term, yes or no? Have we got sufficient results to share?
It's almost a 50-50 split with
50-50.
51.4 saying no.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, because as a tool, this is probably the most powerful tool available to the project manager. And if you've never encountered it, I think this is something that you will benefit from in your projects. Now, those of you who've already encountered it, hopefully this is just a brief refresher. But the basic concept of a work breakdown structure, as the name suggests, how do we tackle a big complex project? We divide and conquer. We break it down into smaller significant elements and then take each significant element and break it down into more detail. The WBS, or the work breakdown structure, is the single most powerful tool in the project manager's toolbox because it helps you to identify all the scope and only the scope for the entire project. It's also something that when you get to the lowest levels of the WBS, that's the level where you can define quality attributes of every component within your project. It's the level at which you would get far better estimating to occur. And if you've got, for instance, costs of each separate component going into an assembly, then the detailed costs are going to be much more accurate than just having a ballpark figure for the higher level. So it tends to be the level at which you estimate. It's also the level where the project manager controls what's happening in the project. Now, I've got a very simple couple of examples here. They're not comprehensive because to try and show all the components that make up building a house, it would need to be, everybody's screen would need to be 10 times wider. But here we've got two different teams. One team has looked at disciplines or teams within the building a house project. They divided the project amongst jobs being done by the bricklayers, jobs being done by the electricians, the carpenters and plumbers and so on. And then the bricklayers have determined all the tasks they've got to do. Here we're concentrating on laying the walls and building the chimneys. The electricians are concentrating on the mains power supplies and then the in-wall wiring and so on and so forth. The second team have looked at building a house and they're much more phase driven. They're looking at the phase of the project and they've got some sort of initial works and supplies. They've got the main construction occurring and then they've got finishing off. And as they take the supplies, they're thinking about the mains power to the site. We're talking about the drainage that needs to be sorted out. As we move into construction, we've got the walls, the roof and the chimney to be constructed and so on. So the question I've got on the left-hand side, it's a bit of a rhetorical question. Which is right? Should we be doing it by team or discipline? Or should we be doing it by phase? Which of those is the correct way of breaking the work down? If you wouldn't mind just typing something into the chat field. What I'd like to think is happening is we're seeing either is perfectly valid. And the answer is that neither one of those is correct compared with the other, because as long as you do them comprehensively, you'll get the full scope of the project being defined. If you don't do things comprehensively, that can trip you up. But if you do it comprehensively, the bottom level should be the same. So it doesn't matter whether you go by team, by phase, by major component. Different organizations might find that a certain style of breakdown, particularly if you're, for instance, you're in an automotive industry where you know there's going to be 13 major phases of work. You often look at each phase and you look at the deliverables within those phases. Another project could be organized more by departments or disciplines, in which case they look at the work that's going to be handled by each part of the organization, and they're much more comfortable by breaking things down by the top view. So neither is right. And a lot of the challenge of getting a WBS is actually, how should we organize the work? Often there's many ways of doing so. Here I've got a slightly more sort of a project a little bit more related to people's experiences. Here we've got a surface vehicle system divided down into the surface vehicles, test evaluation being carried out, training, support equipment, and then we're producing the breakdown. Who should develop a work breakdown structure? Who should develop the work breakdown structure? I'm a big fan of the project manager facilitating the process, but you get key representatives of the project helping to generate the content. It's one of those activities where if you actually physically get people in the same room, this is, prior to any risk from COVID, people sort of looking at a big wall with, generating post-it notes, people with big, flip charts, organizing the detail. It tends to be something that people take responsibility for when they're actually creating the post-it notes, generating the content. I've come across occasions when we've got a situation where people are actually relying upon the project manager too much. And the problem is that project manager creating the entire breakdown structure, people might not point out the errors in what they've generated, or the terminology might be different from what they're expecting. Some project managers are very, very, forceful and say, this is what we're going to be doing. They're missing out on the fact that the team will often have some insights about detailed aspects of the project. Also, if you do it as a team, the team's effort converts the work breakdown structure into our WBS rather than the project managers. So how far should we break things down? We should break things down until we have control. We should break things down until we have control. And therefore, we might have a fairly high level breakdown when we're looking at the initial assessment of the concept phase, say, when we're thinking about alternative ways of carrying out the project or alternative scopes. But then when we're more into the detailed planning, we break things down into more detail. But the lowest level for a typical sort of engineering project could be a work package rather than a detailed activity. The theory of work breakdown structures could be that we actually identify all the products first and then generate the detail all the way down to activities. But on a significant project, we often refer to a work package, a package of work that can be handled to a team or to an individual within the team. There's some common pitfalls here, not including representatives from every part of the project. For instance, if we've got a technically oriented team and they haven't included, say, the training or the documentation required to support the project, people could underestimate the scope of work to do with actually properly carrying out the training. If we're not inclusive, then we're going to have sometimes people just guessing what another part of the project team has to do, in which case we tend to underestimate other people's work. Again, if you've got technically oriented people, they'll very much concentrate on the big pieces of kit that needs to be organized and coordinated. They might forget about some things like, if we're commissioning a system, what about temporary facilities? What about sort of lighting and energy in a given location in order to trial out certain components being assembled for the first time? If we focus on big pieces of kit, do we sometimes forget about the fact that we might have permitting that needs to be organized? Could we have, again, the missing documentation? Getting caught up in sequencing can occur when you're getting people to produce a breakdown. Sometimes people say, oh, no, don't do that. You've got to do this first. When you're doing the breakdown structure, it's very much we do this and we do the next item and we do the next. So you're trying to ensure that you're being inclusive, the full scope is being identified. And if you miss out things like a heading for project management, you might be underestimating the investment in your project in terms of making sure the project's more likely to be successfully delivered. Documentation. Owner's cost is a term where you are, for instance, working at a remote location and you've got to buy the land before you start setting up the site that you're going to be working on. It could also be security aspects, that when you carry out work, we want to make sure that nobody can encroach upon the location. For a large project that's been done in a remote location, owner's costs can amount to sort of easily 20% of the total cost of the project. Remember, if it's not in your WBS, it's not in your project. Therefore, the full scope of the project wants to be identified. We've got a final slide here focusing upon breakdown structures. There are multiple different types of breakdown structures you could encounter. I'm not going to go into the detail because it would take us far too long. But if you organization, for instance, insist on you doing a product breakdown structure first, that is very useful when you've got a highly technical project and there are many components that are going to be assembled together to form your aircraft or your sort of major item of equipment. When you look at the products, you're focusing upon the deliverables or the outputs first, and then you think about all the work to design and manufacture and construct those given items. The organizational breakdown structure is really useful, particularly when you've got multiple organizations. You've got a lot of external contractors combining their work in your projects. It's good for you to clarify who's reporting to whom in the organizational breakdown structure and which organization or department do they come from. It helps you sort of understand the hierarchy. Cost breakdown structure is useful for when you are in a competitive tendering situation. Often your customer is actually asking you to produce breakdown of the cost so that they can separate the material cost from the project management cost from the other core project activities. And that way they can sort of compare one tender with another. The resource breakdown structure is used when you include things like other types of equipment. If you've got to sort of involve sort of various items of equipment in addition to the people. So the organizational breakdown structure focuses upon the people and where they report to. The resource breakdown structure identifies what kind of machinery and tools you might have in addition to the people involved in the project. And then the risk breakdown structure is a great way of categorizing risks so that you can flag risks in one area or another. So unfortunately, we haven't got the time to go into those other breakdown structures, but a breakdown structure, the graphical format is the one that we saw previously, where we have the equivalent of the post-it notes laid out in a structure. Very useful early on for sort of engaging with stakeholders, just so that people are aware of the main structure. The indented or outline format tends to be just using the indentations to show that building a house is made up of supplies, construction and finishing, and then supplies is made up of mains, power and drainage. When you are producing, say, a detailed schedule, you often find the left-hand side of your documentation shows you the indenting structure of how things actually form. And when you're using the indented or outline format, it enables you to have a multi-page report encompassing all the detail, whereas the graphical format tends to swamp you with too much information. So we've got just a quick poll for people to wrap up the work breakdown structure. I hope it was useful, even though for those people who are already knowledgeable about the WBS. Poll number 8. For those of you who answered no to knowing the term WBS, do you think you would find it useful in your next project? This is a brief answer response, so you can just type in your response there. For those of you who answered no, do you think you will use it in your next project? Hopefully you've got the opportunity. I've got to admit, I wasn't presented with that. If you weren't able to respond, you can just type it into the chat so we've got a record of that response. Now, moving on to the third and final tool of the presentation. We've got the tool known as the Moscow tool. Again, we've got a quick poll here, so we could call up poll number 9. Have you heard of the Moscow prioritization tool? Not the city, but the Moscow prioritization tool. The answer is yes, I have, and I've used it regularly on projects, or I use it regularly on projects. Yes, and I have used it, possibly not on projects, but in other ways. Yes, I understand it, but I've never used it. Yes, but not sure what it is. No, not until now, or other. So could you please vote? Have you heard of the Moscow prioritization tool? Yes, and I use it regularly on projects. Yes, I have used it. Yes, I understand it, but have not used it. Yes, but not sure what it is. And no, not until now, or other. If you could please respond, just to give us a view on how known this is.
The results are no, not until now, about 80%.
Fantastic. Well, I hope I'm giving you value for money on this presentation, because the Moscow tool I've found an incredibly useful tool in workshops, and we're going to use it with respect to a project, but you sometimes find it's a tool that you can use in different scenarios. Now, here we've got scenario A. You're not involved in a mechanical engineering project. You actually have got roped into helping sort out a building that is in a dreadful state. It's on site, it's in a dreadful state, and somehow you've got lumbered with the job of project managing this project. We need this building refurbished, a senior stakeholder shares with you. And of course, you start to have all these requirements. Oh, the flooring is currently causing trip hazards. Somebody else brings to your attention the toilets in our estate need sorting out. The monitors are old. The heating needs looking at. I need new desks. Lighting isn't very good. The windows are drafty. Storage is inadequate. Electrics. Has anybody ever been on a project where you just get all these different requirements and things are chaotic? If you could just use the chat just to give us some feedback there. If you've ever been in that situation, the early stage of the project could probably be plotted out as my stress level is going through the roof. So as more and more of requirements come your way and you're just thinking, wow, there's so many people, so much to do. How do I start handling that? So what we do is we think through our repertoire of tools that we could use to prioritize the needs and wants of our stakeholders. So this is the secondary scenario. And we think back to that webinar we attended, and we could use the Moscow tool. Now, the structure of the Moscow tool is quite simple. The M for Moscow stands for musts. And if you're wondering why there's an O following on, you could argue that the musts are over the shoulds. Sounds like a cheat to me, but the musts are over the shoulds. So the shoulds are the secondary level. The coulds are the third level, and the won'ts are things we are determining should not be carried out in the project. Now, when you think of the essentials, the musts should be the showstoppers. If somebody says this is a must, if you can't deliver that aspect of the project, then you don't bother doing the project. It's just going to be useless. So musts could be actually quite a small set of either deliverables or requirements. If you go to the secondary level, the shoulds are still important. They're only secondary to must, so they're the next level. The shoulds, you really do want to deliver against them, but they're not quite showstoppers, but you could be really upsetting some stakeholders if they weren't delivered. Now, the coulds are sometimes referred to as the nice to haves. The coulds are often desirable for several stakeholders, and hence you still want to deliver up the entire scope of the project. Once it's agreed, you should be hopefully setting up enough resource, enough budget, enough timescale to do everything that is within the boundaries of the project, because everything within the must, shoulds and coulds is the intent of the project team to deliver. When you look at a project and suddenly somebody starts talking about landscaping the surrounding area, and you say, well, hang on a minute, we've got a real challenge here getting this building up to scratch. Do you see how you might say, let's agree that landscaping would be a very good follow-on project? But if you think about it, if we're accessing that location, we're having all sorts of contractors, getting to that location, we really don't want to do the landscaping yet, because we could do with a nice calm environment in order to get it sorted. Otherwise, it will get damaged in the process. So you would be taking the landscaping out of the core topics. So looking at our Moscow technique, I've drawn it as a big rectangle on a bigger background. So you could have, for instance, a big flip chart, and you're occupying 80% of the flip chart with your could, shoulds, and musts, but you've got space around it to de-scope things if need be. Using in anger, we line up the contents of the project. So do you remember that initial slide where we had all that chaos coming onto the slide of I want the toilet sorted out, the roofing needs fixing, etc. We just made 9 post-it notes, and we could be clarifying that each of those means sort out the electrics, sort out the toilets, the roof, etc. And then as project manager, you take a step back and you allow the stakeholders to approach those post-it notes and whatever you've laid out to show the must, shoulds and coulds and the won'ts, and you let the stakeholders discuss the relative importance. Now, if people know the term Brownian motion from chemistry days, what happens is the post-it notes are sort of repositioned by the stakeholders, and the stakeholders might be disagreeing about the position of certain post-it notes. And as the facilitator, you're taking a step back and allowing them to discuss and get to grips with just how important these items are. You could have the health and safety representative saying, hang on, that flooring is absolutely essential. They're tripping hazards. We could be in real serious danger if we don't get that sorted. And other people could be pointing out, their perspectives. So after a while, eventually, the post-it notes are distributed by the stakeholders. They've recognised that monitors actually aren't that bad. We can carry on. Storage is really quite important to one of the stakeholders, but most of the others are saying it's less important than actually getting the desks and the toilets and the heating and the windows sorted out. But you know what? Roof is actually damaging the fabric of the building. The floorings are tripping hazard, and those electrics would not pass a full electrical test. So those are the absolute essentials. I hope that makes sense to everybody, that you have been the facilitator, and your stakeholders, who could have got upset with you with their individual claims not being given the support they see, they're discussing it directly with other stakeholders. Having done that analysis, there's a bombshell. It just happened to be that each of those 9 items came to £10,000. Pure coincidence. We had a budget of 90k to cover things, so we included the management costs under that heading. But the budget's been cut from 90,000 to 80,000. What shall we do? Well, there are several options here. It might look obvious to you that the obvious thing to do is to de-scope something, but there's a possibility you could lower the spec of everything, and you could get every item saving a bit of money. The cleaner way, in terms of being sort of making sure the quality is still delivered, you do the simple calculation. Okay, we had the 9,000-10,000 pound work packages. That was 90k. We're down to 80k. That means there's only 8 items we can afford. 1 item needs to be taken out of scope. Do you see how the stakeholders themselves will be naturally looking at monitors and storage and discussing the benefits of monitors and storage? And it could be that the person whose storage demands, is quite strident about defending storage, and we recognize monitors could be replaced later on. They're not actually harming people's ISET. We could be shifting the monitors out of scope. I hope that sort of is useful to you as a tool, because what I would say is I probably use Moscow, if not weekly, every other week in sort of workshops with clients, and it's a very powerful way for the project manager to facilitate the process as a whole. We've got a final poll question here. For those of you who were not users of the Moscow tool or hadn't heard of it before, how likely are to use it when you need to prioritize deliverables or requirements in the future? Very likely, likely, unlikely, or won't use it. So very likely, likely, unlikely, or won't use it. If you could just share that final poll, please. Are we able to share it? I seem to have lost communications here. I hope you can hear. Oh, fantastic. So, so very likely 40.4, 56.6 likely, unlikely because it's not relevant to you. Thank you very much for sharing that. We covered the 3 main topics of power interest grid, the work breakdown structure, the Moscow tool. I think these are 3 very powerful tools, and collectively they help you address a lot of the problems you might have when working either directly in a project or having to project manage. There is one final word of warning about tools. This is a quotation from Grady Booch, not only the co-author of the Unified Modeling Language, he's also chief scientist at IBM. A fool with a tool is still a fool. So it's great we've got so many intelligent people here, because intelligent people use tools well. Be careful of using the tool without really understanding how to use it effectively. Now, we're going to allow some time for questions to follow on from this, but I know that Darren wants to share a bit of information with you first, so I'll move on to the first slide.
Yeah, thank you, Derek, for that presentation. I'm sure you're getting a virtual round of applause as we speak. Yeah, it's just to quickly, if people are interested in further learning and development around project management, we have a number of courses coming up, which you can probably see on your screen. So we have the R&D project management course running in Sheffield in the 5th and 6th of October, and in Coventry on the 16th and 17th of November. We also have an APM project fundamentals qualification in London on the 18th and 19th of October. We have a managing engineering projects course on the 20th and 21st of October in London. And also we have the APM project management qualification, which is a 5-day course in Warwick in December. I think the last 3 of those courses are being run by yourself, Derek. Is that correct?
That's correct. So I hope I haven't put you off. Sorry.
And the other option, if as an organisation that you have a number of people that you think will benefit from training, we can do training for in-company courses as well. So just to bear that in mind. And finally, for me, just briefly, yeah, if you are interested in becoming professionally registered as well, you can find more information on the website, but we're here to help in that regard as well. So either contact us on the email address there, or go to the website, and there's a number of workshops as well that can help people interested in becoming professionally registered. We can help with that as well. But that's it from me. So if you have any further questions, I've got a number in the inbox now, which I'm going to address to Derek. So I'll do it in chronological order then. This is quite interesting, this actually, which is a bit off topic, but we'll ask the question. Who would you consider a customer to be a stakeholder?
Yes. That was a short and sweet answer. I'm just wondering why the customer wouldn't be considered a stakeholder. Would you say the customer's interested in what they're going to get? Could the customer have a lot of power in terms of what happens if they're refusing to pay for something that they think is substandard? I think it ticks quite a few boxes of why you'd actually want to understand the customer's requirements, and you'd want to make sure that what you deliver, the customer is very happy with paying for, the work that you carry out. So I don't know if that's adequately covered. That is my view, but I think the customer is typically a very important participant in a project. If you're talking about a customer of like Joe Public is buying a product that's been manufactured, etc., well, probably you're interested in things like market research. So you might actually be wanting to poll customers as a group and find out what's likely to be attractive, because if you're actually generating a product that your organization is going to sell, you certainly want it to be successful in the marketplace. So we sometimes have we poll people. We try to get sort of super customers, as in ones who really do do sort of represent multiple parties. Thank you very much.
Another question here. Would you create more than one type of breakdown structure for the same project?
The answer to that is yes. If you're sophisticated as an organization and you're really trying to control something effectively, very often an organizational breakdown structure is something you produce very early on to get clarity about who's actually involved in this project. There could be holes initially in the organization breakdown structure because you might not have appointed all the contractors that you're going to make use of, but there'll certainly likely to be an internal core of people involved in the project. So you want clarity as to who do you need in the project. So the OBS is one of the breakdown structures. If I'm dealing with a big technical project and there are many components that make up assemblies and many sub-assemblies are making up, further constructs, you often benefit from doing a product breakdown structure, focusing upon the deliverables and outputs. But in order to deliver each of those outputs and deliverables, you might have all sorts of regulatory approvals and design activities to produce those products. So often, for big technical projects, you have a product breakdown structure, and then you reinforce it with all the work to be done being the work breakdown structure that follows on from the product breakdown structure. If you're in a commercial setting, often you need to be able to reorganize the information in a cost breakdown structure format in order to present it in the format that your customer's asking for. And I think those are some examples of the fact that you often use multiple breakdown structures. A word of warning: sometimes you get, for very large projects, the organization actually spins off one team who are controlling costs and one team who are more controlling sort of the scope of the project in terms of the coordinating the timing. And what can happen is the two teams actually start to develop two different breakdown structures. It's extremely dangerous when you go through change control to actually ensure the impact analysis is properly considered and that both breakdown structures reflect a single entity. Ideally, you benefit from having a single work breakdown structure that is used universally, but the bigger the project, the more likely you are to find that the actual administration of a single breakdown structure is such that you can't actually handle it. Like if you've got a multi-million pound project, you might find that you need to have smaller teams, but you've got to maintain that focus upon it's all based upon a single breakdown structure.
Very good. Yeah, quite a few questions, so we'll try and whiz through a couple more. Question here is, what if the stakeholders never agree with the Moscow chart at all?
Well, possibly you might need to escalate it to actually say, how can we be doing this project without some foundation? So the interesting thing is that if you actually have people together, they tend to have to work through differences more than if you actually have people firing emails at each other. Because a lot of projects, one person is maybe got a history of they don't agree with that department, and one manager is disagreeing with another manager, and you are in the middle. It could be challenging to get those two people in the same room if it's about personalities, But unless there is agreement about what the project has to deliver, do you see how the organization as a whole is very keen to resolve these differences in order to get a proper understanding of what's occurring? It could be that there's a disagreement about how the project is to be delivered. There's a whole host of conflict management approaches that you might then need to start working upon. So you might need to be addressing the different opinions, find out what the root causes are, and you go through other approaches in order to handle what is the true problem here. But if the stakeholders can't agree using Moscow, then there's some deep-seated problems within the organization, and you probably have to use further techniques. Conflict resolution is not a straightforward process. You might even need to get a third party to act as an arbiter to help the process go forward.
Very good.
I hope that's answered your question.
There's a few questions on a similar thread here about people saying, what's the best way to get into project management in terms of training and qualifications? I suppose as an L&D organization, this is something we should address, but it's a difficult one, I guess, but any thoughts on that one?
Well, I've just gone back to the further education and development available slide that we've got available to us. Now, that sounds like the salesman's approach here, but what I would say is that project management as a discipline, there is lots of opportunities, in terms of development. Most organizations see the value of investing in their staff in order to support their development of project management capabilities, because it's not necessarily that you're going to be, the project manager of a big project, but even if you are handling work, a lot of the skills within project management are very transferable, very useful. So if you're handling a part of a project, then you're a sub-project manager, and the project management skills and capabilities are vital to you. So I've got to admit, a lot of organizations support your development of your mechanical engineering accreditation. They're often very supportive of you getting training in project management, and the skills that you develop help you be more effective in your organizations, full stop.
Yeah, as a non-project manager who's actually did a formal project management course, I can honestly say it's probably the most practical and most beneficial course I've done. I'm not just saying that, it was incredibly useful. So yeah, we probably have time for one last question. Within a project life cycle, would you refresh the power stroke interest grid, or is it a one-shot exercise? You
may be re-evaluating the power interest grid because of significant change in stakeholders, or just as a good thing to do, because sometimes the needs of the stakeholders change radically. Certainly, we recognise the need for changing what we're delivering. If we actually have an agile approach to delivering the project, you often find that stakeholders suddenly realise that the direction they were heading in is not the right direction, and they might have a completely different perspective on things. You certainly want to, when you're refreshing the power interest grid, remember the monitoring. Monitoring requires you to continue to look at where those participants lie. What happens if you lose your sponsor and you get a fresh sponsor? Well, that sponsor, you need to reevaluate, are they in the right position? There is an alternative to the sort of like the supporters side. You can actually look at people who are also detractors as well, and you can have a mirror image of that power interest grid. Alternatively, you could show the people who are supporters in green and the detractors in red. So the power interest grid is not a one-shot use. It is a tool that you might be reevaluating, revisiting regularly, particularly if there are changes in your stakeholders or there's changes in the actual needs of the project.
Excellent. I've probably got another 12 questions I could ask you, and I'm just conscious that we'll try and speak one more if we can. So,
fantastic.
How would you select the most appropriate tool out of the 3 tools, and what would be the deciding factors?
I would say they do different things. So the 3 tools are tools in your armory. You tend to use them at different stages of a project. So understanding your stakeholders is like is a key thing to do early on in the project. Your work breakdown structure is a tool you use early on to scope the project as a whole and maybe compare one option with another and then use it again later on. So these are not exclusive tools, they're tools that actually are used as and when appropriate. So it's not an either or, it's an and situation to use them when you need them. And I think tools are great because you can, if you've got them in your toolbox, you can whip them out and use them in a given situation. So things like breakdown structures, it doesn't need to be for the project as a whole. It could just be for a piece of work that needs doing. You're actually using a tool that's still very powerful.
Perfect. That's a good way to end. So, yep, we've reached the hour. So again, thank you for everyone who's attended. Hopefully you found it incredibly interesting and of value. Please refer to the website for further information on project management training, etc. And finally, just a big thank you to Derek for an excellent presentation.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And can I just say thank you very much for those excellent questions and for your attention throughout that hour. I hope it was fun as well. You had some, you could relax and enjoy the presentation as well.
Brilliant. Thank you all.